Hello, I am back today for the second part of this fun challenge of looking at books I've logged in GoodReads and how my star rating compares to the general star rating of the readership of these titles. And I'm slightly nervous about this because this is looking at my lowest rated books on GoodReads. So we are at the bottom of the barrel here. There's going to be lots of stank faces from me as I talk about these books and relive the experience of reading them. So I don't often rate all that many books very low because a lot of the time if I'm not enjoying a book I might just give up on it. But these are books that actively frustrated me or annoyed me in some way, or in some cases offended me, and often there are really interesting ideas, I think, in them that could have been explored, but in a much better way, or there was a missed opportunity to explore a question that I thought was at the heart of the book, but which just really wasn't carried out in a very good way. So I am realizing as well that some of these books were rated fairly highly, and so probably a lot of people really enjoyed them, and I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes or to discount your reading experience. Every reading experience is unique, and we all respond and relate to books in different ways, so don't think I'm coming for your book, because I know we can take books we read in a really personal way, so let's not make this personal. Let's try to keep this fun, and hopefully this will be a difference of opinions, or maybe you might even agree with my opinion of really not liking this book. And a lot of these books have received a lot of praise as well, like critical praise and some like award nominations, which I just really don't understand. So yeah, I'm gonna go through my GoodReads profile now and do a search of my worst rated books, and starting with the absolute bottom of books that I rated only 1 star. And the first one that comes up is a book I've mentioned a number of times, which I just absolutely hated, which is First Love by Gwendoline Riley. And this novel made me so angry and frustrated because it felt like the author was really withholding letting us get to know the characters. There's characters with a lot of really bad emotional issues in this, and that are just really horrible to each other, and we follow them through this story, which doesn't let you actually get to know the characters or why they're this way. I mean, I'm not one of those people that needs to read about characters that I like or relate to, or that I feel like I see myself in. I'm perfectly happy to read about despicable characters, don't get me wrong, but just the way that the author handles this, it's just superficial detail, I feel like, and I really didn't understand why they were acting this way towards each other. But you see all of the horrible things that they say and do to one another still. So I described how I felt like the experience of reading this book is like being emotionally vomited over, because I just felt completely covered in all of their dirty laundry without understanding them. And so I should also say, like, I'm just going on what I remember about these books, and I did write full reviews of all these books I'm going to talk about, so I'll put links to those below if you want to hear my slightly more put together thoughts about these books. But so that book is a total miss from me, and I've not read anything else by Gwendoline Riley because I think her other books would really annoy me as well. And I'm satisfied to see that it looks like a general readership kind of agrees with me or has middling feelings about this book, because there's an average rating of 3.18. So I'm glad some other people feel this way about this novel as well. Okay, next is actually a biography about Thomas Cromwell's life by Diarmaid MacCulloch, which I'd read specifically in order to read Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and her trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, so I could better understand his life, because as I talked about in my previous video about some of my favorite books, because Mantel's books went on to become some of my favorite books, but it was really difficult to get into them because I didn't have all that much knowledge about Thomas Cromwell's life, and there's a lot in those novels about the politics of the time. So I read this biography just to gear up for reading Hilary Mantel, but it was a really difficult experience. It's a very long book. There's lots of tedious detail in it about the politics of the time, which I felt like I didn't, or it could have been conveyed in a more artful way. Also, he weirdly skips over some important parts of Thomas Cromwell's life, like his early life, but also towards the end of his life and his downfall, and he just seems to kind of skip over those bits. And I fully know that, you know, his early life, we don't know all that much about it. There might not be all that much factual evidence about it, but yeah, it felt like he could have handled that in a slightly better way, and there's just, yeah, so much detail in it which he gets bogged down in, which I just found such a slog, and I was so happy to be done with this biography when I finished it and to finally get into some of the fiction. I think it's also slightly a matter of personal taste as well. I don't enjoy reading biographies as much as I enjoy reading novels, and I realize that some people really enjoy reading lots of biographies about a whole range of figures, but unless the biography is creatively done, I find it a bit difficult to get into them, and the general readership for this has rated this 4.09, so a lot of people seem to really respect this book, and I respect what he did of gathering all this detail together, but yeah, the way he did it just didn't really work for me. Next is one of these prize contenders, which is The War of the Poor by Eric Vuillard, which is about the life of Thomas Müntzer, who is a radical theologian in his time in Germany and in Europe a couple of centuries ago, who was speaking out against the church and the corruption in the church, and how it wasn't connecting with the working classes and poor, or serving them in the way that it should, which is ideology I could really get behind, but I felt like this novel is so short and so brief, and just like touches upon a number of interesting points without developing them or turning them into something interesting, that I just found it really frustrating and more like a Wikipedia entry than either a novel or a biography. I would have gladly read either about this figure from history, but the way it invokes his life I just felt was too brief, and I did listen to some people's arguments at the time when it was listed for the International Booker Prize about how it's written more like a pamphlet, like this figure would have written himself, and how at the time that was the only way to disperse information, especially to people that might not be literate, and which is an interesting idea, but that's just a concept, and that doesn't mean that the book is actually going to be good and so yeah, as a reading experience I just found it way too frustrating. The Hummingbird by Sandro Veronesi, which is a novel I read last year and was so frustrated by, because I felt like you were just supposed to love this central character, the way he was written about, and just totally care about him, but it didn't interrogate his faults enough. I thought I just found that so frustrating, and it made me really angry, especially because his wife had mental health issues, and the way that this central character talks about with his wife's psychologist and how they talk about her issues in this way, which is so callous and not respectful and really unprofessional, and how that wasn't interrogated I thought was so frustrating. And also the end of it just really annoyed me, because it felt like he was almost being portrayed as this saintly figure when I felt like he really wasn't. Second Place by Rachel Cusk, another novel that I read because it was listed for the main Booker Prize last year, and I had issues with Rachel Cusk's novel Outline, but I did really like some aspects about it, but there was virtually nothing I liked about this novel, Second Place. Again, all the characters were quite unlikable, but and especially the central narrator, but again, I felt like it didn't interrogate her unlikability enough, or her faults enough, or her sense of delusion of being kind of persecuted, and that is actually realized in the plot of the story itself, as this artist she takes into her home becomes an antagonist for her. And like, he starts off seemingly quite sympathetic, but then he starts acting out in these horrible ways, which felt really unrealistic, and I just didn't understand his character or the relationship she was trying to portray in this. It was kind of trying to portray like differences between how men and women are treated in society, and the way that they treat each other, but it didn't work at all for me. And it has a relatively high rating of 3.75, so I think a lot of people liked this novel a lot more than I do, but I think Rachel Cusk is another one of those writers that I just don't get along with the way she crafts her fiction. So those are all the 1-star books I have logged in Goodreads, and there's not very many of them. I'm sure I've read some other books I would rate 1 star, but I just haven't happened to have logged within Goodreads. So I'm going to look at some of the 2-star rating books now, which I think there are some aspects of these books probably that are redeemable and interesting, but as a whole probably the books really didn't work for me. So first off, there's All the Devils Are Here by David Seabrook, which is a strange sort of book in that it's kind of somewhere between a memoir and journalism, as this figure visits a number of British seaside towns and locations that he had a personal connection to. And I think probably part of my frustration of it was that it wasn't one thing or another. Like, I wish it had been like all a memoir or all just like a journalistic account of these decaying or dying seaside towns, but it didn't fully fulfill either of them, and so I just wasn't satisfied by the experience of it and was quite like frustrated. Again, I felt like it was like almost withholding information and not giving me the full story that it could have done, or been as emotionally open as it could have been in order to be effective. The Bear by Clair Cameron, and this is a novel I read quite some time ago, so I'm a bit sketchy on the details. I remember it's a novel about 2 children kind of wandering in the woods and that are under threat from a bear, which is quite a tense situation, but I just remember so much of the novel in like the middle of it. I think the beginning and end are pretty good, but most of the middle of it is just a bit tedious and felt like it was treading water. And also it's narrated from a child's point of view, which is always a tricky thing, I think, for authors to get right in their novels, and in this novel I don't think it succeeds. Satin Island by Tom McCarthy, who I do think is a really interesting writer, but this novel just didn't really come together for me. I think I read it several years ago when it was listed for the Booker Prize, and yeah, I just felt like it was too much a novel of ideas instead of being a fully realized story. And I think that can happen sometimes with some slightly more, intellectual authors that have this like great concept for a novel, and so put all those ideas into a story, but in that way it just feels too forced. It doesn't feel like this is a story I can become emotionally invested in, and so I felt that with this book. And I remember how I think I read an interview or something at one point with Tom McCarthy, who said when he was writing this book, he purposefully like limited himself to just sitting in a barren room where he was sitting at a desk looking at a blank wall. And the experience of reading the book really feels like a book that was produced in that way, of someone that was just like I'm gonna write this novel and has a concept but doesn't carry it out into a fuller story that I could really care about. This Mournable Body by Tsitsi Dangarembga, and actually I'd read this novel a few years ago as a buddy read with some other booktubers and when it first came out in America, and it wasn't published here in the UK till quite a lot after, so it was listed for the Booker Prize last year, but yeah, I'd read it quite some time ago and was quite baffled by its listing and the quite general, like big positive response to this book. I mean, it has a rating of 3.33, so it's a bit middling, but yeah, I personally didn't really connect with the story. There was lots of aspects of it that I liked and thought were interesting in following this woman's life, who is just kind of drifting along and hasn't been able to establish a firm existence for herself. But then it brushed over some parts which I thought should have been developed and would have been more interesting. Like, I remember at one point she becomes a teacher and she has all these difficulties in the school, but this is covered really quickly, and then she leaves this employment, and then that's it. That's all you get to it, when that could have been a much fuller and interesting story. It could have been a whole novel in itself, but yeah, so just as a whole, it didn't really work for me. Bottled Goods by Sophie van Llewyn, and this is a novel I read quite a long time ago as well, or at least it feels like a long time ago, and not much of it stuck with me. And I think because of the way it was structured, it's a novel, but it's almost put together almost more like flash fiction. You just get these little snippets of different events, and they are connected to each other, but yeah, you only get little pieces of this story of life under communist Romania, which is an interesting subject matter, but I just felt like it wasn't developed fully enough, that it was an interesting approach she took to it, but just went by too quickly and didn't really stick with me. Although the general opinion of this seems to be fairly positive, of a general rating of 3.77. But yeah, to me, it just kind of missed the mark. Who Killed My Father by Edouard Louis. And this is a memoir about where the author is looking at the experience of his father, who became very seriously ill because of the working class conditions they were living under. And so yeah, it's an interesting subject for an exploration, especially because this author has written so powerfully in his previous books and his first novel about his relationship with very strained relationship with his parents. And so yeah, I thought it was interesting in that way, but it felt more to me like sketches of ideas rather than a fully realized book or memoir or nonfiction account looking into these issues. I just felt like he was dropping in a lot of general terms for why he and his family were afflicted, rather than interrogating those concepts and really trying to develop and see the full complexity of them. So yeah, there were some touching moments in it, I remember, but yeah, it just felt overall too much like a sketch to me. I did really like and appreciate and felt emotionally involved in his debut novel, but yeah, this book really didn't work for me. And I maybe this is wrong, but I feel like the general high rating of 4.11 is more out of love for this author than for this actual text. That's me making a really big assumption, but that's the feeling I get. Another French book, Born of No Woman by Franck Boyce, a kind of gothic novel about a woman who dies and a priest that goes to investigate her life, because she was born to difficult circumstances, but then went to live at this mansion where she was horrifically taken advantage of and made part of a very sinister scheme of the lord of the manor and his mother. And I did appreciate some of the creepy aspects of this novel, but felt overall that the characters were too one note and not very rounded as characters, so I found it not very emotionally satisfying at all. The New Wilderness by Diane Cook, and I felt like this is a novel where the reading experience of it was probably really tempered by my expectations, since it was listed for the Booker Prize, and I was just expecting a whole lot more than what I felt I got, in that this story that's set in this kind of dystopian society in the future, where there are tribes of people sort of roving around in the wilderness. And there were some moments of it I thought were really emotionally compelling, in that I connected to and felt invested in. But as a whole, I just felt like this kind of dystopian society wasn't developed well enough, and so yeah, as a whole it didn't really work for me, and I was just hoping for so much more. Quichotte by Salman Rushdie, which is another novel that was like Booker Prize nominated and that I just really didn't get on with, and I think in general I just don't really connect to the way this author writes. I haven't read all that much of his work, but the books of his I have read, I just didn't really connect with, and I felt it was kind of a satire, and some of the humor of it didn't really work for me, and I found a bit grating and frustrating, and so yeah, as a whole, this book really frustrated me, even though the concept, again, like the concept I thought was really interesting, of taking Don Quixote and bringing him more into the present day and dealing with some present day issues, but that was just the concept, and the execution of it was poor. Next, it was a very controversial book, which is American Dirt by Jeanine Cummins, which there was really big stink around this at the time, and so yeah, I'm just gonna talk about the book in itself, because I did make a whole video talking about the whole issue about whether this should even be a book that we should read or not, which I know even just that question is like a really big issue for readers, but yeah, there was a lot of complicated issues all around that. But the actual book itself, which I did read in full, in total, so tried to give it as good a chance as I could, putting aside all of the other issues around it. Just the book in itself just felt like kind of a conventional thriller to me that had these political issues kind of stuck onto it. So yeah, I found that a bit frustrating, and didn't allow me to emotionally connect to the characters in the way that they should at the time. I mean, the whole concept that this big like gang leader was a customer in a bookstore that the main character, the mother, worked at, and that they developed this connection with each other, and then he started hounding her because she was a witness to a crime of her husband being executed, and the way that they like connected over literature, and but then he was like chasing her or sending out goons to chase her as she raced to tried to find asylum in America. As a plot device, that really grated with me. And those are all of the 2-star books I've logged. So now I'm just going to look at several 3-star books, which, yeah, I think I did get quite a lot out of, and I was glad to have read these books, but that had some issues which made them not wholly satisfying reading experiences for me. So first book I'm going to look at is Story of the Eye by George Bataille, and this very sexually explicit book, written many years ago, and probably written in a time and context which I mean was quite radical, and probably would still be considered quite radical. A lot of the content of this book, it's the places it goes to, and sometimes it did feel like it was just trying to be willfully shocking in its explicitness and the situations it shows. But I also really took issues. I mean, there are some instances of rape in the book, and it didn't feel like it was treating those depictions and characters in the sensitive way that they should be. It just kind of brushed over them, and also because it was written quite a while ago, there are some dated references in this which are really grating to read about now, and I understand it was written in a particular time and place, but at the same time I can't help responding to that in the present day and taking issue with it. Here's another classic, which is The Blithedale Romance by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is one of his lesser known books, and I think lesser known probably for a good reason, because I was so excited to read this book about an intentional community, which is based off from a real life, like intentional community, but he doesn't explore the complexities of this community, I think, well enough, and reverts more to kind of a conventional plot of a kind of love story and a like tense thriller almost-ish sort of plot, which just didn't really work for me. And so yeah, I found really disappointed by this. A Spell of Winter by Helen Dunmore, and this is another novel I think that suffered slightly from my expectations of it, whereas I felt the actual reading experience was just quite disappointing, because this was the very first winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction, so I was really excited to experience and read it, and it's the first book I'd read by Helen Dunmore, and the story I thought was quite compelling and interesting, but the way it was plotted out, it just felt really lackluster in the end, and I couldn't really connect with it, and it was some very strange choices I thought that the author made in how she did that, though there was some really beautiful writing to it, and I remember it being quite atmospheric, but yeah, just didn't really work. They by Kay Dick, and I'd read this quite recently, which is, it was being sort of marketed as a lost classic, but I think it was kind of lost for a reason, because it's just more like sketches of this kind of dystopian society where there's these menacing figures in the distance, and I didn't even really feel like it was, I mean, the author might not have intended to write it as a dystopian society. It just came across more as these like deeply uneasy situation of these artists being persecuted by this amorphous mass, menacing mass out in the distance, that were impinging upon their lives and taking things away and harming them in some quite violent ways. But yeah, it just came across more to me like a kind of artistic personality that was complaining about being misunderstood, and also the kind of whinging about larger aspects of society like popular culture and music and television, and so yeah, I found it quite frustrating to read. In the Beginning Was the Sea by Thomas Gonzalez, and this is a novel set in rural Colombia about two outsiders that come to this rural community and sort of intrude upon it, and they have these artistic aspirations and ideas for living in a more harmonious way, which don't pan out. And I felt like it's kind of a satire, but is really weird in its tone, in that it handles the more peripheral characters in the story in a very callous and disrespectful way. So I found the whole overall tone of it to be quite weird and confusing. So there were interesting aspects of it, but just as a whole, it kind of grated with me. Here's a big, much loved and popular novel, The Martian by Andy Weir, which is a novel I felt quite conflicted about, because the actual story I enjoyed, and I enjoyed all the like scientific and technical detail about what it would be like to be stranded on Mars and trying to survive, and so yeah, that was interesting. I felt engaged by the thrilling story, but then the whole overall tone of it just had this weird like masculine kind of jokey sense to it, which grated with me. It's not my sort of narration that I enjoy reading about, so I think it's much more like a personal experience, because a lot of people really enjoyed this book. Has a general rating of 4.41, so very high. This kind of like juvenile, boyish like sense of humor to it, which I just found a bit icky, but the actual story I found engaging and thrilling. Another novel that was quite popular and much loved is Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman, and I was just, somebody asked me about this recently in the comments, whether I'd read this book or not, and yeah, I did read it, but overall I found it a bit frustrating and not very satisfying, and a bit troublesome of how this character is handled, she's very reserved and has a very methodical way she approaches her life, and has difficulty expressing or realizing her emotions, and which is an interesting situation and character to write about it. But the whole overall tone of the book I found really uneven and odd. There's a kind of sense of humor to the story where it almost felt like at some points the author was poking fun at the character, and also the way the plot was handled and controlled just didn't quite work for me. But obviously it's really connected with a lot of people. I think a novel exploring a similar character and situation that works much better than this is Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. I would very highly suggest that novel over this one. And then finally, a novel that actually won the International Booker Prize, but was probably one of my least favorite books on the list. And I remember the rest of the list was really strong, which is The Discomfort of Evening by Marieke Lucas Regnevald. And this novel about a character, a girl living on a farm whose brother has died and so had this tragedy which all of the family are wrestling to deal with. And the whole atmosphere of the novel was written quite well and was quite interesting, but there were some aspects of the book which I felt were really tricky. There was a scene, a very violent scene, which I felt really wasn't handled with the respect it deserved. And also the ending of the novel I absolutely hated, and just it really frustrated me. And so yeah, it's one of those books that the rest of the novel, there were aspects of it I really thought were interesting, and some of it I even really liked, but yeah, the ending was just such a stinker and really frustrating. So those are all the books I'm gonna talk about. Yeah, I'd love to know in the comments if you have any thoughts about these books, if you've read them, if you agree with me or if you disagree with me, and that's totally fine. We can have differences of opinions, but yeah, this was an interesting exercise to go through, and I'd love to know some of the books you have rated the worst on GoodReads in the comments below, and I might agree or disagree with that judgment as well. But yeah, this is a fun exercise to do. So thank you for watching, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.